Welcome to the Rubenstein Distinguished Lecture today. We are thrilled to welcome you. As you heard, I am Interim Dean of the Sanford School. My name is Manoj Mohanan, and I'm delighted to be here. Our lecture today is made possible by the generous support of David Rubenstein, and we thank him for his long-time engagement with the Sanford School and for making this lecture series possible. Also, a special thanks to our colleagues and partners at the DeWitt Wallace Center. They are co-sponsors of today's lecture. The DeWitt Wallace Center for Media and Democracy celebrates its 50 years this year. As you know, this is also the 100th year of Duke University, and this lecture today is part of Duke's special centennial event. We're looking forward to the talk today by our special guest, David Brooks, followed by a question and answer session, which will be moderated by Duke alumna Lisa Borders, both of whose brief bios are here. As you know, Lisa is also a member of our Board of Trustees of the Duke University. And now, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, David Brooks. As you know, David is an op ed columnist for the New York Times and appears regularly on several news shows, including the PBS Hour, NPR's All Things Considered, and NBC's Meet the Press. He is the author of many multiple bestsellers, including the one that we are discussing today, How to Know a Person, The Art of Seeing Others Deeply and Being Deeply Seen. Without further ado, let me welcome David Brooks.
Oh, somebody knows me because I'm a big Springsteen fan. And Manish he travels the world to see Dire Straits. I've gone to Europe several times to see Bruce Springsteen because when you go to a Springsteen show in America, everybody's 90 years old. I literally sat next to a fan with a guy with an oxygen mask at my last concert. But in Europe, 20-year-olds watch him. It's a pleasure to be back here at Duke. I taught here the year of 2006, 2007. And so I loved my time here. You guys were too friendly, so I had to go off to the University of Chicago. But I was friends with a guy named Dick Broadhead, who was president here. And Dick kindly invited me to at least 2 games that year at Cameron. The first one was against Columbia University. And the Duke students were yelling at the Columbia students, "Safety school, safety school." Totally unfair, by the way. It's kind of hard to get into Columbia. And then the second was the UNC game at Cameron. So I've reached the apogee of my life. It's all been downhill since. So I'm going to talk about human connection. And you should know I wrote a whole book about it, but it's not because I'm naturally good at it. This is my natural. I think when we meet Lisa, we'll find someone who is naturally an illuminator. But if you ever saw that movie Fiddler on the Roof, you know how warm and huggy Jewish families can be. They're always singing and laughing and dancing. I come from the other kind of Jewish family. And so the culture in my home was think Yiddish, act British. And so it was super stiff upper lip, never show emotion. And so we were not like living from the heart. I had 2 turtles. That was the sign of our family. We had the emotional register. We could handle a turtle. A dog would have been too much. And then when I was 7, I read a book called Paddington the Bear and decided at that moment I wanted to become a writer. And so that's also a solitary profession. I get up every morning at 7 in the morning, and normally when I'm home, I work till 1. And I used to wear a Fitbit, and the Fitbit would tell me I was napping. But I guess my heart rate went down, so I was just doing what God put me on this earth to do, which is to be a writer. And writing was part of my core identity in high school. I remember in high school I wanted to date a woman named Bernice. She didn't want to date me. She dated some other guy. And I remember thinking, what is she thinking? I write way better than that guy. So those were my values, but not hers. I was not a great high school student. And when I was 18, the admissions officers at Columbia, Wesleyan, and Brown decided I should go to the University of Chicago. And if you know anything about Chicago, the famous saying, it's where fun goes to die. It's a very cerebral place. My favorite saying about it, it's a Baptist school where atheist professors teach Jewish students St. Thomas Aquinas. And even today, the kids wear shirts. Sure, it works in practice, but does it work in theory? And so, very cerebral place. I came there and I fit right in. I had a double major at Chicago in history and celibacy while I was there. And I remember freshman year, we entered my freshman roommate in the Golden Gloves boxing competition. He had never boxed a day in his life, but we gave him a nickname, the Kosher Killer, and we trained the University of Chicago way. We didn't practice boxing, but we read a lot of books about boxing. And his career lasted 29 seconds. And so I was living very much up in my head. And then I got a job as a newspaper columnist. And that's also can be kind of solitary. I was hired to be the conservative columnist of the New York Times, which is a job I likened to being the chief rabbi at Mecca. Not a lot of company there. But it keeps you busy. And for the students here, being a columnist is like, imagine having a paper due in 3 days, and then that's the rest of your life. So it's a lot of churning out ideas. And so it kept me up in my head. And then I got a job in TV. And you would think TV would have loosened me up because it's a more emotional medium. You know, you think Oprah and all this stuff. But I got a job on the most cerebral version of TV, which is the PBS NewsHour. And so we have 14-minute conversations about fiscal policy. And that's our emotional limit. And we have a wonderful audience, very thoughtful, very public-spirited, somewhat seasoned. And so if a 93-year-old lady comes up to me in the airport, I know what she's going to say. I don't watch your program, but my mother loves it. So that's our core. So we're very big in the hospice community. And so I decided in middle age, and there was a moment that symbolized a bad way to live for me. I'm a big baseball fan, and I've been to 1,000 games. I've never caught a foul ball. But I'm in Baltimore with my youngest son a number of years ago, and the batter loses control of the bat. It flies in the air and lands in my lap. And getting a bat is 1,000 times better than getting a ball. And so any normal human being would be jumping up and down, high-fiving everybody, hugging, getting on the Jumbotron. I put the bat on the ground and just sat there. I had the emotional reaction of a raccoon. I just sat there. And so I look back on that guy and think, show a little joy. And so I've tried to make myself more emotionally available to people, more better at social life and intimacy. And, you know, becoming a father loosens you up a little. Having some failures loosens you up. And I worked on it. I wrote a book about emotion called The Social Animal. And when I was trying to improve my soul, I wrote a book about character called The Road to Character. And I learned that writing a book on character doesn't actually give good character. And even reading a book on character doesn't give you good character. But buying a book on character does give you good character. So I recommend that. And I've loosened up. I think it's somewhat worked, and I can prove it. I was at Nantucket at a conference a couple years ago, and the speaker had a group like this, and he gave everybody in it a piece of paper with which on it lyrics to a love song. And he says to us, find a stranger, gaze into their eyes, and sing the love song to them. And so I found some old guy, and I gazed into his eyes, and I sang the love song to him. And if you had told me to do that 20 years ago, I would have spontaneously combusted. But I did it. I was proud of myself for being like sincere and emotionally open. There were no sparks between us, unfortunately. It was just like no romance, but I did it. The sad thing is, as I've been trying to get a little more human, American society has become a little more dehumanized. And so you know the rising suicide rate. Suicides are up by 30% since 2000. Rising depression rates. 36% of Americans report feeling lonely much of the time. 45% of high school students report feeling hopeless and despondent much of the time. The number of Americans who say that no one knows me well is 54%. The number of Americans who say they have no close friends is up by 4-fold since 2000. The number of Americans not in a romantic partner is up by 1/3 since 2000. The number of Americans who rate themselves in the lowest happiness category is up by 50% since 2000. So we've just become sadder as a country. And when you become sadder as a country, you become meaner. Because if you feel yourself unseen, invisible, you feel threatened and you feel insulted, that your dignity has been insulted, which it has been. And so people who feel unseen want to lash out. They want to attack. And so I won't give you all the mean statistics, but hate crimes, gun violence. The one that gets me is maybe 10 years ago, 2/3 of Americans gave to charity. That's down to below 50% right now. And the most important social statistic is about social trust. Do we trust each other? generation ago or 2 generations ago, if you asked people, do you trust your neighbors, people around you, are they trustworthy? 60% said yeah. Now it's down to 30%. And among millennial and Gen Z, it's down to 19%. And so we've just become a more distrustful society. And the sad part is people use politics as an attempt to cure their loneliness. When you leave people naked and alone, they do with their evolutionary roots, they want to find a tribe. And politics gives you the illusion of community. I'm on Team Red, I'm in Team Blue. You're not really in community, you're just hating the same people. Politics gives you the illusion of you're doing moral action on behalf of society, but you're not visiting a widow or serving the poor. You're just indignant on Twitter. And so politics gives you the illusion of membership. There's a guy named Ryan Streeter at the University of Texas who reports that people who call themselves lonely are 7 times more likely to be active in politics than other people. But it doesn't give you a cure to your loneliness. It just enters you into moral and cultural war. And so you leave loneliness, but you enter brutality. So what's the cause of the spiritual, social, and relational crisis that undergirds a lot of our politics? I could tell you a bunch of stories. The technology story, social media is driving us crazy. I think that's true. The sociology story, we're less active in civic life. I think that's true. There's an economy story, we're more unequal and living more diverse lives, different kinds of lives, because the economic gaps are so wide. I think all those stories are true, but the one I focus on is the most direct, which is that for a couple generations now, we have neglected to teach people the social skills needed to be considerate to people in the complex circumstances of life. These are basic skills. How do you be a good listener? How do you reveal vulnerability with your friends at an appropriate place? How do you sit with someone who's grieving? How do you break up with someone without crushing their heart? How do you host a dinner party so everybody feels included? These are basic social skills. How do you end a conversation gracefully? I remember I went to my 5th high school reunion and nobody had told me how to end a conversation gracefully. And my only move was to say, I'm going to go get another drink. And so I'm 20 minutes into my first high school reunion. I'm so drunk I have to leave because I've gone to the bar 6 times. And there's one skill that's at the apex of all these skills. And that's the ability to make other people feel seen, heard, respected. To make them feel seen. And so that's the crucial skill at the center of any healthy school, family, nation. And so how good are you at this skill? Well, I've only met a few of you, but I can say with great confidence, you're not as good as you think you are. There's a guy at the University of Texas who studies this, and when we meet somebody for the first time, we accurately understand what's going on in their head about 22% of the time. Some people are pretty good, they're at 55%. Some people are at 0% but think they're 100%. And those are the people missing all your social cues. And so I write in the book this dichotomy that there are 2 classic types of people. There are diminishers and illuminators. And diminishers are people who are incurious about you. Sometimes I leave a party and I think, that whole time nobody asked me a question. And I've come to believe only 30% of humanity are question askers. The rest are nice, they're just not curious about you. Or they stereotype, or they ignore, or they do a thing called stacking, where I learn one fact about you, and then I make a whole series of assumptions about who you must be. You're a Trump voter, therefore you must be X, Y, Z. And people are never as simple as those stereotypes. The other kind of people are called illuminators, and those are the people who are curious about you. They make you feel lit up. And so there was a novelist about 120, 130 years ago in Great Britain called E.M. Forster, and his biographer wrote of him, to speak to him was to be seduced by an inverse charisma, a sense of being listened to with such intensity, you had to be your most honest, sharpest, and best self. It'd be nice to be able to listen with that kind of intensity. There was a woman named Jenny Jerome who later on would become Winston Churchill's mom. But when she was a young woman in the UK and Britain in the Victorian era, one night she was seated next to William Gladstone, the Prime Minister of England. And she left that dinner thinking that Gladstone was the cleverest person in England. Sometime later, she's at a different dinner, and she happens to be seated next to Gladstone's great political rival, Benjamin Disraeli. And she left that dinner thinking that she was the cleverest person in England. So it's good to be Gladstone. It's great to be able to make people feel the way Disraeli apparently could. And so those are illuminators. And how do you become a better illuminator? I'll just walk us through a few steps. The first is when you first meet somebody. When you first meet somebody, they're unconsciously asking themselves the same question you're unconsciously asking yourself, which is this person going to be nice to me? Am I a priority to this person? Am I a person to this person? And the answers to those questions will be expressed in your eyes before any words come out of your mouth. As we go through life, we imagine people are evaluating us by how competent we are. But most of the time, we're being evaluated on how warm we are. And so I was at a diner in Waco, Texas, and I'm having breakfast with a 93-year-old lady who was a former school teacher named LaRue Dorsey. And Mrs. Dorsey presented herself to me as a stern disciplinarian. She said, I loved my students enough to be tough with them. And I was a little intimidated by this formidable lady. She was like a drill sergeant. And into the diner walks a mutual friend of ours, a pastor named Jimmy Durrell. And Jimmy sees us both. He knows us both. He comes up to our table. He grabs Mrs. Dorsey by the shoulders, and he shakes her way harder than you should ever shake a 93-year-old. And he says to her, Miss Dorsey, you're the best. You're the best. I love you. I love you. And that stern disciplinarian, in an instant, turns into a bright, eye-shining 9-year-old girl. He brought forth a different version of her with his warmth. And partly it's because Jimmy has a warmer personality than I do. But partly he is a pastor. He pastors the homeless in Waco. And so when he sees anybody, he sees somebody with a soul of infinite value and dignity. He sees somebody so important that Jesus was willing to die for that person. Now, you can be Christian, Jewish, atheist, Buddhist, whatever, I don't care. But seeing each person you meet with that level of reverence and respect is the precondition for seeing them well. So the first is the gaze. The second step in this process is accompaniment. Most of life, we're not having big, deep, heart-to-heart conversations. We're just hanging out. We're at a meeting. We're picking up our kids from school, whatever. It's normal life. Accompaniment is an other-centered way of being in the normal circumstances of life. Think of the way a pianist accompanies a singer. He's paying close attention to her. He's seeing what she's trying to do, and he's trying to make her shine. And so in the concrete circumstances of life, you're hyper aware of what the other person around you may be going through. And sometimes it's just casual being supportive of them, asking them a question. Sometimes it's more profound and being present for them when they need you. So I used to teach at the Duke of New Haven, and I had a student named Jillian Sawyer, and I had her as a grad student. But when Jillian was in college, her dad got pancreatic cancer. And they had the conversation that he would probably have to miss a lot of the events of her life, including her wedding. And he died after college, and sometime after that, she was invited to be the bridesmaid at a friend's wedding. And she goes to that wedding, and she watches the father of the bride give a beautiful toast to his daughter. And then it comes time at the reception for the father-daughter dance. And it's been too close for Jillian, so she decides, I just can't sit through this. And she goes to the ladies' room to have a cry. When she comes out of the ladies' room a few minutes later, all the people that were at her table at the reception and the adjacent table are standing in the hallway. And she wrote a paper about what happened next, which she's given me permission to quote. She wrote, "What I will remember forever is that no one said a word. Each person, including the newer boyfriends who I knew less well, gave me a reaffirming hug and headed back to their table. No one lingered or awkwardly tried to validate my grief. They were there for me just for a moment, and it was exactly what I needed." So somebody at one of those tables said, let's all go on the hallway for Jillian. And that's the art of showing up. That's the art of presence, accompaniment. The third stage, and the most important, is conversation. And so I live in Washington, and I'm surrounded by people who are in politics. And so we are not necessarily good at conversation. I call Washington, D.C. the most emotionally avoidant city on the face of the earth. And so I was talking to a friend of mine who was in the Obama administration some years ago, obviously, and he was talking to me about some issue or something, and I'm on my cell phone, and the call drops. So I think, oh, he'll realize the call's dropped. He'll call me back in a minute or two. So I wait 2 minutes, and then I wait 4 minutes, and then I wait 6 minutes and 8 minutes, and finally I call his office, and I talked to his assistant, and she said, oh, he can't come to the phone. He's on the phone. And I say to her, he's on the phone with me. He's been bloviating for 10 minutes. He does not know I'm not on the other side. So that's a Washington conversation. hope to have better conversations that are a little more reciprocal. And so for this book, I called up a bunch of conversation experts and said, give me some tips. And some of them are things like treat attention as an on-off switch, not a dimmer. If you're going to be attending someone, make it 100% or 0%, don't 60% it. 2, be a loud listener. I have a buddy who lives outside of Philadelphia, and when you talk to him, it's like you're talking to a charismatic Pentecostal church. He's like, yes, yes, I get it. Preach that, amen, amen. Love talking to that guy. He's a loud listener. Don't fear the pause. If we're having a more meaningful conversation, and I make a comment that starts at my shoulder and ends at my fingertips, at what point have you stopped listening because you're trying to think of what to say in response? Probably right about here. So if it's a really important thing I'm saying, let me talk to my fingertips and then pause and then do a response. I read somewhere that the Japanese are comfortable with 8-second pauses in between comments. Thoughtful way of going out life. I'm a New Yorker. We're tolerant of 0-second pauses. Another tip was don't be a topper. If you say to me, I just had this horrible flight. We were on the tarmac for 2 hours. My inclination is to say to you is, oh, I know exactly what you're going through. I had a horrible flight. We were on the tarmac for 6 hours. And it sounds like I'm trying to relate to you. Well, really what I'm saying is let's pay less attention to your inferior set of experiences and more to my superior set. So don't be a topper. And then keep the gem statement in the center. If you're having a disagreement with somebody, there's probably something deep down you agree upon. So if my brother and I are fighting about our dad's health care, deep down we both want what's best for our dad. If we keep that thing we agree upon, the gem statement, in the center, then we preserve the relationship amid disagreement. Just ways to have better conversations. But the ultimate way is to ask really good questions. And I know everybody in this room used to be a great question asker because you're all former 3-year-olds. And 3-year-olds ask like 200 questions an hour. And then it goes down. But kids are just good question askers. I have a friend named Naomi Way who teaches 7th grade boys, among other things, in New York City, how to be journalists, how to ask questions. So the first time she ever did this, she said she got in the front of the class and she said to the students, you can ask me absolutely anything and I will answer it honestly. So the first boy said, are you married? And she said, no. And the second boy said, are you divorced? She said, yes. And the third boy said, do you still love him? She was like, whoa, whoa, whoa. And she started crying. And she said, yes. And the next boy said, does he know you still love him? And the next boy, do your kids know you still love him? Like a boom, boom, boom. Kids are great question askers. I've learned in the course of my journalism career to ask storytelling questions. So I don't ask people, what do you believe? I asked, how'd you come to believe that? And then they're telling me about a person or experience that shaped their values. I read across a great storytelling question in a book called You're Not Listening by a writer named Kate Murphy. And she's writing about a lady who was running focus groups. And she was hired by the grocery stores to figure out why people go to the grocery store late at night. And she could have said, why'd you go to the grocery store late at night? But instead she asked a storytelling question. Tell me about the last time you went to the grocery store after 11 p.m. And there's been a lady in the focus group, hadn't said anything, who said, well, I smoked a joint and I need a menage a trois with me, Ben, and Jerry. And so you get a little glimpse into her life. And so I've learned to ask good questions. I start by asking people about their names or where they grew up. People love talking about their childhood. I asked a guy here at Duke at the Div School, what's your favorite unimportant thing about you? And if he'd asked me, I would have said, well, I like early Taylor Swift better than later Taylor Swift, actually. And he said to me, and he's a big theologian, he revealed that he watches way too much trashy reality dating TV, like Love is Blind, that kind of thing. And I wish I didn't know that about him now, but it was a way of getting to know him. And then my favorite questions, once you really get to know somebody, are big questions that get them to re-examine their life. And so those are things like, what crossroads are you at? What transition are you in the middle of? If this 5 years is a chapter in your life, what's the chapter about? Or things like, can you be yourself where you are and still fit in? Or a question, what would you do if you weren't afraid? I had a buddy who was being interviewed for a job, And he turned around to the interviewer at the end and said, "What would you do if you weren't afraid?" And she started crying because she wouldn't be doing HR at that company. And I took his little hint. I used to ask my Yale kids, "What would you do if you weren't afraid?" And every year, one or two would come up to me privately and say, "I wouldn't be at Yale. It's not quite the right school for me, but I'm afraid to leave the prestige." So fear plays a role in our lives. When you really get to know somebody really well, there's a guy named Peter Block who writes beautiful books on community. He has deep questions to ask, but you really better know somebody well before you ask these questions. And there are things like, what is the no or refusal you keep postponing? What commitments have you made that you no longer believe in? What is the gift you currently hold in exile? What talent do you have that you're not using? And those are penetrating questions that lead big conversations. I remember I was back at home in DC. I was reminded of this yesterday. I was walking around Nashville, and there was a young black woman in a T-shirt, and the T-shirt said, "My ancestors are my ghostwriters." I think it's a profound message because we're all formed by our ancestors in a certain way, our ethnic heritage, by our families. They form us in deep ways. So I had asked the question about a year ago, how do your ancestors show up in your life? Which is the same sort of sentiment. And there was a Dutch family at our dinner table, and they told us about what Dutch culture is like, how it formed them. There was a black couple. They talked about African American experience. I talked about 5,000 years of Jewish history, which I'm sure was a scintillating 2.5 hours for them. But it was a good conversation because we didn't quite know the answer. We're all formed by heritage, but we all had to think about it, how it shaped us. So far, I've tried to tell how do you get to know someone in normal times. But we don't really live in normal times. We live in harsh times, as I mentioned at the start, in sad and mean times. And so we have to have harsh conversations. And I'll just tell you quickly about a couple of the harsh conversations I've had to have. And one involved my oldest friend in the world, was a guy named Pete. And we met when we were 12, and we went to the same summer camp from age 5 to 23. We weren't campers. They did promote us to counselor. And we stayed lifelong friends. And when Pete was 57, he suffered from a severe case of depression. And I consider myself a fairly literate guy, but I didn't really even know what depression was. And I learned over the course of his illness that if you're lucky enough to not been hit by depression, you can understand it by extrapolating from your own moments of sadness. It's not like that. Another friend of mine who suffered from depression said, depression is a malfunction in the instrument you use to perceive reality. And so in Pete's case, he had these voices, these lying voices in his head saying, "You're worthless, you're worthless. Your family would be better off without you. No one would miss you if you're gone." So he had these voices constantly barraging him. And I did not possess the right social skills to know how to accompany him through this illness. And so I made some of the mistakes that I've now learned are classic mistakes. First thing I tried to do is try to give him ideas how to make the depression lift. And he was an eye surgeon, and he used to go on these service trips to do cataract surgeries for free in Vietnam, and he found it so rewarding. I said, "You should go back to Vietnam, do those service trips." And I have since learned that if you're trying to give depressed people ideas about how to make a lift, all you're doing is showing you just don't get it. Because it's not ideas they're missing. It may be desire, pleasure, a lot of other things, but it's not ideas. The second mistake I made was I tried to cheer him up, remind him of all the good things in his life. You have a great marriage, your boys are amazing, you love your career. But have since learned all I was doing was reminding him that he wasn't enjoying the things that are palpably enjoyable. So I was making him feel worse. And gradually I learned a few things about this. And I think the first thing I should have done and learned to do was confront the reality of the situation. This sucks. This sucks. Tell me exactly how it sucks. Because Pete felt isolated in his pain because it was hard to express to others. And so if you ask, tell me about the pain, what exactly is it like? At least you're joining them a little in that experience they're going through, and they feel a little less isolated. Second thing I wish I'd done more of is constant touches, just a text every day, just to remind him we're not going anywhere here. Just while you know I'm thinking about you, no response necessary. Third thing I learned from a pastor is just a burst of goodwill. I want more for you. I want more for you. And those words won't cure anything, no words will. But at least I'm on your side. I'm on your side. And then I read a book I've read several times. I hope many of you have read this, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning. So he's an Austrian psychiatrist. He's in the Nazi prison camps. And he confronts a lot of people who are thinking about suicide. And so his words to them were, sounds harsh, but maybe effective. Life has not stopped expecting things of you. There are still tasks on this earth that you can do. And especially since you've gone through suffering, you have credibility with those who suffer. So those are the kind of hard conversations I learned over the 3 years that Pete suffered from this disease. The other kind of hard conversation is across political difference. And so I'm sort of a center-right Democrat, I guess. Isaiah Berlin, one of my heroes, said he was happy to be on the rightward edge of the leftward tendency. That's about where I find myself these days. So I get attacked from left, but also from the Trumpian right. I'm at a baseball game. I think I told some students this today. Years ago, all my stories start at baseball games. And the guy recognized me in the ninth inning. He turns around. He says, "Are you David Brooks?" And I said, "Sure, yeah, I am." I expect him to say, "Oh, I like your writing," or whatever. But instead he says, "You're a fucking asshole." And my son was there. He tried to calm him down. And the guy said, "You should be ashamed to have that guy as your father. He's a disgrace." And my wife tried to calm down. And he said, "Get off me, woman." And he said, "Look, my hand is shaking. I'm in the presence of pure evil." And I think what I should have done is say, "Hey, can I buy you a beer? I'd like to understand what you're going through." But sadly, I have testosterone too. And so me and my son verbally wailed on the guy. And my wife after was furious with us. And she was right to be. I've come to believe when somebody comes at you with difference and with critique, your first job is to stand in their standpoint. It's to ask them 3 or 4 more times, "Tell me more about your point of view. What am I missing here? What am I missing here?" And you may not, make them like you, but at least you'll be showing them respect, the respect of curiosity. There's a great book called Crucial Conversations by a guy named Joseph Guarini and a bunch of other people. And they say in every conversation, respect is like air. When it's present, nobody notices. And when it's absent, it's all anybody can think about. And that guy felt disrespected by people like me. And so I could have taken the opportunity, I've hopefully done it since, just to say, let me stand in your standpoint. Tell me more. And I think that's the only thing that can be done. So I go around asking people, "Tell me about a time you felt seen." And often people tell me about stories, about teachers. A guy told me about his daughter in second grade. She was struggling, and he said to her, and the teacher said to her one day, "You're really good at thinking before you speak." And that little comment turned the girl's ear around because she thought her weakness was social awkwardness. But her teacher saw that as a strength. And I remember when I heard that story, I remember my 11th grade teacher talking to me. I was making some smart-ass comment in class, and she said in front of the whole class, "David, you're trying to get by on glibness. Stop it." And on the one hand, I was humiliated. But on the other hand, I thought, wow, she really knows me. I'm so honored. There's a guy named Rabbi Elliot Kula who had a congregant who suffered a brain injury, and sometimes she just fell to the floor. And people would rush to lift her up. And she told Kula, "I think people rush to help me up because they are so uncomfortable with seeing an adult lying on the floor. But what I really need is for someone to get down on the ground with me." And that to me is a great definition of empathy. Being willing to get down on the ground with someone, even if it makes you uncomfortable. Other times I find scenes of someone who saw somebody else in history books. I was reading a book about Franklin Roosevelt and the early 1930s, early days of the New Deal. He's in the Oval Office and he has a meeting with a 28-year-old congressman named Lyndon Johnson. And after the meeting, FDR turns to his aide, Harold Ickes, and says, "Harold, that's the kind of uninhibited young pro I might have been as a young man if I hadn't gone to Harvard." And then he says, "In the next couple of generations, the balance of power in this country is going to shift to the South and West. And that kid, Lyndon Johnson, could well be the first Southwestern president." So that's a pretty good prediction. And so that's seeing somebody, and recognizing political talent. Sometimes you hear about these cases and they're quite moving. So I read in a book called Lost and Found by a writer named Catherine Schultz about a case. She's writing about her dad, who was named Isaac, and he sounds like a wonderful dad. He had opinions about everything from whether apple cobbler is better than apple crisp to the infield fly rule in baseball. He sounds like he was a great storyteller, just a wonderful guy. At the end of his life, apparently, he just went silent. He just stopped talking. And neither the doctors nor the family could understand it because talking was what he did. And then in the book, she describes his final day. And he's silent, but the family sits around him and they take turns saying the things they didn't want to leave unsaid. And she describes the scene. My father, mute but seemingly alert, looked from one face to the next as we spoke, his brown eyes shining with tears. I had always hated to see him cry and seldom did, but for once I was grateful. It gave me hope that from what may have been the last time in his life, and perhaps the most important, he understood. If nothing else, he knew that everywhere he looked that evening, he found himself where he had always been with his family, the center of the circle, the source and subject of our abiding love. So that was a guy who died well seen. And if it's great to feel seen, it's also great to be the seer. And so I was once, a couple of years ago, I was sitting at my dining room table reading a boring book, which is I get paid to do. And my wife comes in the front door, which you can see from our dining room table. And she pauses on the threshold. And the door's open and the summer sun is coming in behind her. And she's standing there and her eye comes to rest on an orchid we keep by the table by the front door. And she doesn't even notice I'm there, because that's the kind of charisma I have. And so I look at her and she's just sitting there looking at the orchid, thinking about something. And I think, wow, I really know her. I know her through and through. And if you had asked me what I knew about her at that moment, it was not like her resume. It was not even her personality traits I would use to describe her to a person. It was more just the flow of her music, the ebb and rise of her symphony, like her whole way of being. And it was almost like, her incandescence of her personality, or occasional flashes of fierceness, sometimes some insecurities. And it was almost as if I wasn't seeing her, I was seeing out from her. And when you get to know someone really well, you have the joyous ability to see a little how they see the world. And if you had asked me to describe how I was looking at her at that moment, I wasn't observing her, I wasn't inspecting her. The only word in the English language I can think of is I was beholding her. Just this appreciative gaze. And a couple weeks after it happened, I told some friends about it, and they said, that's what we do with our grandkids. We just behold them. And it was a great moment. And so it was one of the great moments of human connection. So we live in a brutal age, a bitter, angry time. And the famous dates of our century are brutal dates. September 11th, January 6th, October 7th. And there's a tendency to want to cover yourself over and to cover up and to make yourself impregnable. But the thesis of the book is that it's not naive to lead with curiosity. And it's not naive to lead with vulnerability and to lead with trust. That you will be betrayed sometimes and it'll hurt, but it's still worth it to go through your life as a trusting person. And most of the time you'll bring out the best in others. But it is hard. Last December or so, I was in a bar having a drink. And if you would, a hotel bar, and if you had seen me, you would have said, sad guy drinking alone. But I call it reporting. And so I'm scrolling through Twitter, and it's scenes from the Middle East. And they're brutal, one brutal image after another. I'm just scrolling through it all. And I happen upon an interview that James Baldwin gave. It looked like, judging from the black and white images, like early 60s or so. And he's telling the unseen interviewer, there may not be as much humanity in the world as one would like to see, but there are some. There's more than one would think. Walk down the street of any city, any afternoon, and look around you. What you've got to remember is what you're looking at is also you. Everyone you're looking at is also you. You could be that person. You could be that sinner. You could be that saint. You've got to decide for yourself who you want to be. Now, our society treated James Baldwin very badly, in part because of his race, in part because of his sexual orientation. And if anybody had earned the right to be bitter and to be hostile, it was him. And still, he clung to this idea you could be the essential trait of humanism. You could be that person. That person could be you. That's the essential claim of human connection. And when I saw the little video, a phrase leapt into my mind: defiant humanism. Being human in defiance of social conditions around you. And it seems to me that's what we're called to be these days. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, David. Now that you've invited us to ask you deep questions, I'd like to invite Duke Trustee Lisa Borders to join you for the question and answers. As I mentioned earlier, Lisa, please join us. Trinity alumna Lisa Borders is CEO of the Golden Glow Media, a multimedia production company, as well as the LMB Group, a management consultancy firm. She earned her Bachelor of Arts from Duke University and her MSHA from the University of Colorado. Lisa, thank you so much for joining us, and I'll leave you to it.
Thank you, Manoj. Good to be here. Was that not the bomb? Wait. This is Duke. David Brooks is in the house. Give him some love.
Safety school.
Listen, let me start with gratitude, David, for you being here with us and writing this book as I've read it. I told David this in the green room, so I'm going to repeat it. There's so many things I know that I've experienced in life, good, bad, and indifferent, things that I've taken away from situations and tried to behave differently. And David just explained it all in 200 pages. It's amazing. So thank you for your candor. Thank you for your humility and your vulnerability. The stories are amazing. Let me just ask you this. As you talked about empathy, I asked David why he didn't write this book 10 years ago. We wouldn't be in this mess with all the politics and whatnot. But as you talked about empathy in the book, meeting people where they are, you told the story about lying down with the woman. Can you talk a little bit more about your definition? You said it's not an emotion. It's a skill that can be learned, taught, cultivated, curated. Really?
Yeah.
Tell us more.
Yeah, so people think empathy is you just gush forward your heart, but it's a lot more than that. So empathy has three different skills attached that go on to make it. The first is mirroring, and that's if we're sitting together, I want to mirror your emotion. And that means I need to be available. And when we're talking, we're naturally doing some synchrony. So when two people are talking, they are talking using the same speed of language. We tend to synchronize how much. We tend to synchronize our vocabularies. We tend to synchronize our breathing patterns. And that's just the human act of mirroring the person next to you. And I'm about to say this, that this is not us, but somehow I'm going to say something that, so when people kiss, I don't want to be so forward. But when people kiss, they are unconsciously appraising the other person's immune system. And
Okay, wait. Hold up, wait a minute. All right, say that again.
They are appraising the other person's immune system. So when you trade saliva, you're unconsciously, and that's why sometimes there's chemistry with people and sometimes there isn't. So there's evolutionary reasons you want to marry somebody with a complementary immune system. Anyway, that got us off track. So the first stage is mirroring. And the second stage is mentalizing. And that's where I put myself in your shoes. So if it's your first day on the job, I remember my first day on the job. And I know there's the complex mix of emotions. You're excited to be there. Maybe you have a little imposter syndrome. You're trying to remember everybody's names. So because I've had this experience, I can kind of try to imagine. So that's mentalizing, which is called having a theory of mind. And then the third is caring. So con men are really good at getting inside your mind, but we don't call them empathetic because they don't care. And even kids, they if you know you come home crying because you had a bad day at work, a little kid will give you a Band-Aid, which is sweet, but it's not effective care. Like they learn that later. And so one of the skills that goes into into empathy that I think a lot about these days is how to be a good emotional athlete. How do you be the kind of person who can move with emotional agility? So there's a thing called emotional granularity. And people with low emotional granularity can't tell the difference between different emotions. They can't read their own body. And so there's a neuroscientist named Lisa Feldman Barrett at Northeastern. She says a lot of my patients can't tell the difference between depression, which is a down state, and anxiety, which is an up state. And when you have your kid, you take a toy away from your 3-year-old, she says, I hate you. Because she can't tell the difference between hate and angry. I'm angry with you. But some people who are good emotional athletes, they can tell the difference between similar emotions: frustration, tension, stress, impatience, anger. They can finally distinguish their different emotions. And so there's a great book called Between the Hour of Wolf and Dog, about a guy who was a Wall Street trader who became a neuroscientist. And he wrote all these stock bubbles up. And some of the traders knew, this is a bubble, I got to get out before it popped. And so he wanted to know the guys and it was mostly guys because guys are driven to do bubbles by testosterone. He said, what do they have the ability, why were some better? And it wasn't because they were smarter, it's because they were more aware of their own bodies. And so they were more aware. If you asked them, what's your heart rate right now? They could give you a good guess. And they sensed this surging heart rate, and they think, this is the sign we're getting carried away. And so he understood that your brain is there to regulate, for agility, emotional agility, understanding your own body. And to me, these are all parts of empathy, which is getting out of your head and understanding a lot of the most important thinking you do is done in your body, not in your brain.
Okay, that's fascinating. I had not heard about emotional granularity. I had heard of emotional intelligence, which leads me to your conversations in the book about illuminators and diminishers. So some folks can read their own bodies, some people cannot. Some people can read the room, and some people cannot. Can you talk about, obviously, the differences between illuminators and diminishers, and what would be helpful as we look at the crazy world we're living in right now? We're at the Sanford School of Public Policy. Surely, if we had more illuminators, life would be different. So can you talk about those two distinguishing, the characteristics of each of those two types of people?
Well, the illuminators are good at the sort of skills I tried to describe: the gaze, the warm gaze, the accompaniment, the question asking, just going through all the steps. They're humble. And humility is not thinking lowly of yourself, it's seeing yourself from outside yourself accurately. So Abraham Lincoln was a very humble guy, but he knew he was pretty special in some ways. So humility is other-centered awareness of yourself. And when you're humble, your ego doesn't determine that. I don't have the ego to assume that I know what's going on in your head. And so there's a thing called naive realism, where I assume that everybody sees the world the way I see the world. And that flows from ego. And so there was a story it's a joke about a guy who was on one side of the river, and there's a woman on the other side of the river, and she screams at him, how do I get to the other side of the river? And he screams back at her, you are on the other side of the river. And so he couldn't put himself in her point of view. And so you got to have some sense of humility in order to make that connection. But to me, and I'll relate it to the Sanford School, as I said, in Washington, a lot of people go into public policy because they don't like talking about private policy. They don't like talking about intimate stuff. And it's very easy for them to talk about the world, saving the world, but not necessarily saving their friend. And just a generalization I would make over 30 years in this business. But to me, the wisdom of being a good public policy analyst is understanding that most of our political problems have psychological, emotional, and spiritual roots. And so I mentioned the lonely people who are trying to cure their loneliness through politics. Well, the core problem is their loneliness. Or another thing, one of my favorite sayings from psychology is from a guy named John Bowlby, an attachment theorist. All of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. All of life is a series of daring explorations from a secure base. People need that secure base. And we're Americans, we really love personal freedom, and I do too. But most of us, our secure base are not things we chose. Our family, the sacred place where we grew up, our town, often our faith, if you have faith. It's not something quite you choose, it's something you're called to. And to me, a lot of what's happening in American politics, and frankly global politics, is a lot of people don't feel they have a secure base. They feel that the primary attachments of their life are all now optional. And so they don't feel secure in their family life. They feel their town is being left behind. And most importantly and most threateningly, they don't feel they're being held by a secure moral order. So George Marsden is a great historian. He wrote, what gave Martin Luther King's rhetoric its power was the sense that that the right and wrong are woven into the fabric of the universe. And that if segregation is not wrong, nothing is wrong. Slavery is not wrong, nothing's wrong. And when people lose that sense that there's some good and evil woven into the fabric of the universe, there's right and wrong, then they don't have a shell from which they can feel morally secure. And so what happens is demagogues come in, whether it's Viktor Orban or Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or, to get a little political, Donald Trump, and saying, I'm order. I'm giving you order. And we're going to return to the masculine and feminine of 1950s. We're going to return to all the social categories you're comfortable with. We're going to return to male and female. I'm order. And when people feel they don't have a secure base, they think I'll take some of that. And so to me, when we think about public policy, we can talk about inflation rates and all the stuff we normally talk about. But to me, it's always a mistake to leave out the deep psychological and spiritual needs, the longings people have, and how they then turn into political action.
Right. So it sounds like it starts with the individual, right, and radiates outward. And as we look at the polarized environment in which we are today, let's talk a little bit about social interaction and relationships. Can you help us understand if people are secure? I'm going to put that assumption on the table. What would be helpful to establish the connectedness that we have lost or seemingly lost? You gave the statistic about we used to trust our neighbors. We used to be more comfortable in our own skin. And now we seem to be very much afraid of everything. Yeah. My parents used to say fear stood for false evidence appearing real. False evidence appearing real. And it seems that we've adapted some of that false evidence and we're taking it as reality. How do we get back to a place that if we're comfortable with ourselves, then getting comfortable with the person next door or in the next state or in the next country?
So for that, in 2017, I started this program called Weave, the Social Fabric Project. And what we do, we support people who build trust in their neighborhood. And some of them run organizations. So there's a woman named Aisha Butler who lives in Inglewood in Chicago, tough neighborhood. And she was going to move out because there was some violence, and she had a 9-year-old girl. And she moved out, they had a barbecue, said goodbye to all the neighbors. And then when the moving van arrives, she happens to look across the street, and she sees a little girl in a pink dress playing with empty bottles, broken bottles in an empty lot. And she turns to her husband and says, we're not leaving. And he's like, really? And she said, yeah, we're not leaving. We're not going to just be another family who left this. And so she Googles volunteer in Englewood. She has no idea what to do. And she starts hosting documentary series for the neighbors. And now she runs something called Rage, which is the big community organization in Englewood. And you go to Englewood now, and some of the stores have T-shirts, proud son of Englewood, proud daughter of Englewood. And so she's like building trust on the local level because she's a sticker.
Person by person,
Yeah,
bit by bit.
some people are stickers. And so she runs an organization. Some people don't run organizations. I have a friend in D.C. who says, I practice aggressive friendship. So she's the person who invites people over in the neighborhood over to the house. She hosts the Super Bowl party. We were in Florida. We ran into a woman who was helping elementary kids cross the street. And we asked her, do you have time to volunteer in your neighborhood? And she said, no, I don't have any time. And we said, "Are you getting paid to help the kids cross the street?" She said, "No, but in the afternoons I help the kids cross the street." And we said, what do you do in the rest of the day?" And she said, "Well, on Thursdays I bring food to the hospital so the patients will have some nice food to eat." And we said, "Do you have time to volunteer in your neighborhood?" And she said, "No, I have no time at all." And to her, that was not volunteering. That was just being a neighbor. And so when I think of social change happens when a small group of people find a better way to live and the rest of us copy. And the people who are doing this community work, they are pure, they have moral motivations, they love their place, they love their people that live. If you tell me people are not altruistic, I could show you 1,000 people who are altruistic. They lead lives of self-sacrificial love, and we should all love to be like that. And so we tried to lift up their story so other people would behave a little more like them. And so that to me is the first step of rebuilding trust and rebuilding connection. But it occurred to me that they're not only doing that, they're all super good eliminators. They know how to sit with you. And so the reason I wrote the book is because I was writing too much about relationship and community, but those are abstractions. The actual act of relationship is what I'm talking about here. How do you have a good conversation? How do you end the conversation gracefully? Those are just basic social skills. So having worked with all these weavers, I realized I need to get more micro. And that's where the book came from.
So you wrote this book in 2023?
It came out 1 year ago, yeah.
Yeah, 2023. We needed it 10 years ago, but you know, all things in divine time. You've gone through an evolution yourself, and it's been remarkable. I watch you on Meets the Press. Yes. Yeah, I'm 67. I'm proud of it, damn it. So talk a little bit about your evolution and being able to write this book now. After, I mean, you've written 5, 6 books. You write for the New York Times. You write, you speak all the time. What gave you the impetus to put this together and to the grace that you have given yourself and others, because you're looking now outward and saying, listen, there's a better way. There's an enlightened way to do this.
It might be the 10th time my wife took a look at my picture in college and said to me, "I wouldn't have married that guy." So I knew I had to grow. One of the things I'm prouder of is that I'm not the most brilliant guy in the world, but I am a grower. I do change. I'm very different at 60 than I was at 50, and at 50 I was different than 40. And so I had a career way more successful than I ever anticipated. It failed to satisfy, as these things do. And I went through a hard time around 10 or 11 years ago. And so my kids were leaving for school, and that was hard. For the students here, be nice to your parents because it hurts when you leave. And then I went through divorce. And then I realized I'd been misleading my life because I had a lot of weekday friends that I could have lunch, talk about politics. But I didn't have many weekend friends. And the kind of people you just really are intimate with. And so in those days, I was living alone in this crappy little apartment, and I was working. I did what any male idiot would do, was try to work my way through an emotional problem. And so if you got into my kitchen, I wasn't having anybody over, and you pulled in the drawers where there should have been silverware, there was stationery and Post-it notes.
Are you serious right now?
I am very serious. And my wife eventually saw that apartment, and she was like, "What? What kind of loser am I marrying?" So I was lonely. I was also in the best shape of my life because I had nothing else to do, so I took these long runs every day. But I got invited over to a couple's house named Kathy and David, and they had a kid. And it was a Thursday night. I got invited over to their house. In those days, I was saying yes to all invitations. And they had a kid named Santi who was in the D.C. public schools. And he had a friend named James, whose mom had some health and drug issues. And so James didn't always have a place to stay or something to eat. And so I said, well, James can come over here when he needs to. And by the time I get there are 40 kids around the dinner table and 15 mattresses spread around the house. And I walk in that first night, and I reach out to shake a kid's hand and introduce myself. And he said, "We don't really shake hands here. We hug here." And so I'm not the huggiest guy on the face of the earth, but I gave him a hug, and I went to dinner that Thursday, and I went to dinner at that house every Thursday for the next 6 years. And we vacationed together, we did Christmas together, and some of the kids had never had a Christmas present. and they would give them presents wrapped up. They didn't know how to unwrap a present. But those kids beamed their love and attention at us adults. And I call them kids, they were like 17, 18, 19. And they demanded you beam it back. And so they were a bit of an emotional education for me, just being around them for 6 or 7 years. And I'm still around a bunch of them. Some of them have moved away and stuff, but it was like an education. It was permission, and really training in how to just be open and present. And I can prove that it worked, but I'll have to do some name dropping. So I've been fortunate enough in my life twice to be interviewed by Oprah. And the first was in 2014, sort of as this experience was getting going. And the second was in 2019, after I'd been with our chosen family. And after the second interview, she says to me, David, I've rarely seen someone change so much in middle age. You were so emotionally blocked before. And she's Oprah, she should know, right? So like, she's the world expert on this. And so that was actually a very proud moment for me, because it shows no matter what age you are, there's a lot of change that can happen.
Whoa. Y'all didn't know all that, right? So tell us about your kids. Like, you have 3, Joshua, Naomi, Aaron, right? They're all grown now.
They're all grown.
And in different parts of the country. So talk about them and how they embraced your evolution as dad.
Yeah. I would say, to be brutally honest, that's been the hardest. There have been some times where, the most beautiful moments recently for my kids and I, they were all athletes, despite my gene pool. And my 2 boys were good baseball players. My daughter was good at hockey, ice hockey. In fact, she walked into a rink when she was 5 for a birthday party, and she felt immediately at home. And her mom took her into the skate shop to buy her some skates, and she walked over to the figure skating side. And at age 5, Naomi said, no, ice hockey. And she led her team in penalties every year.
She's a bad girl.
Despite being 5'3". And now she coaches hockey in California at age 30. But one nice moment that I've got to experience, maybe you have too, it's like when you move from an adult-child relationship to an adult-adult relationship. Yeah. And so when I was dating after my divorce, and I'm a guy who dated in the Reagan years and the Obama years. And believe me, it was totally different from one generation to another.
All right, we're going to have to go there in just a minute. Keep on going with the kids.
But I called up my daughter in California, and I said, what are you doing this weekend? And she said, I'm a little nervous. I'm about to meet my boyfriend's parents for the first time. And I said to her, that's funny. I'm a little nervous. I'm about to meet my girlfriend's parents for the first time. And in that instant, we moved to adult-adult. And so that was a nice moment where we could be more open and equal with each other. But I will say it's easy for me to be the new David, if we're going to put it that way, with a stranger, because we have no history. But with my kids, we have this long structured relationship going back 30 years, or 25 in one case. And so it's actually a little harder to change with your intimates because you've got so much history together. And so I try to change, but it's something I have to work on. So that's still in process. Them seeing me, the new sensitive dad, rather than the whatever schmo I was before.
No, that would make you human, last time I checked. So there are lots of students here. Where are the students? Where are my students? Ooh, look at that. So if you had to leave some advice, we've read this book. Those who have not, you need to purchase and read this book. What advice would you leave them with for their time here at Duke? Just their time here at Duke, and then we can do beyond. But what advice would you leave them with, particularly about relationships and all that stuff, social connections?
So the first piece of advice I would give is pick 5 or 10 of your best Duke friends and form a giving circle. And so you have this contract. We're going to meet. We're going to put some money in a pot every year, and we're going to give it away. And we're going to meet every year and decide where to give it. And that act of giving away the money will be nice, but that's not why you're doing this. You're doing this so you can walk through life with people who knew you when. There's something so powerful about having adult friendships who knew you before your adult life happened and who knew you who you really were. And so you want to be able to walk through the rest of your life with your best Duke friends. And so that would be the first bit of advice. The second bit of advice, this is also for the year after college. Well, at Yale, I used to bring students who were 5 years out to come talk to the current students. And they would talk about breakups, bad bosses, how hard it is in your 20s. One of my students said, when I was in college, my life was station to station. There was always the next assignment, the next thing to apply for. When you get out, there's no stations. It's just a wide open sea with no landmarks. You have to learn how to navigate. And so the advice I would give about this transition is overinvest in your friendships. You're going to need them. The second is widen your horizon of risk. So I had a friend who she graduated from UVA. She applied to Teach for America. She didn't get in. And so she Googles teach abroad. And there was some guy in Korea who wrote her an email who said, we need a teacher in our fishing village. Would you like to do that? And she said, sure. And she told her parents it was a big organized program with lots of supervision, structure.
Yikes!
But it was just a guy in Korea. And so she flies to Korea to Seoul and then transfers to this little airport with a fishing village. And she lands and there's nobody there to meet her. And she's sitting there and it's 11 at night and the airport shuts down. She's got no money, no Korean. She's shown me her journals. She's in a panic. She's journaling furiously. The one person left was this monk sitting on a bench and he gets up and leaves. So she's all alone. And eventually, like at middle of the night, like 1 a.m, a white van pulls up with 5 guys in it. And the doors open and they say, are you our teacher? And if my daughter did this, I would kill her. But she said yes, and they said, get in the van. And she spent the next 18 months having a wonderful experience in this little village. But the point of the story is not you should get in the van. You should not get in that van. The point of your story, your first job out of college, is to widen your horizon of risk, is to do something kind of out there. So for the rest of your life, you can go through with this wide horizon of risk. And she later became an impact investor in Pakistan, across Africa, because she knows she can go to a strange place and, hey, I handled that, I can handle this. So widening your horizon of risk is a good task for that first year out.
Oh man, I love that. So that was great for the students. Now we got the parents and the professors. What would you tell them?
I do have a story that relates to this job of making human connection between faculty and students. So I was teaching at Yale, and the way my schedule was structured, I taught one class Tuesday afternoon and the next class Wednesday morning. So I'm only in New Haven 1 night a week. And I have office hours at a bar between 9:30 at night and 1 a.m. And that's literally true. The administrators were not thrilled, but I would have 8 kids come gather every year and every week, and I'd feed them. They never had more than 1 glass of wine, but I would feed them charcuterie, and it cost me a fortune, by the way. So I was courting this woman who was living in Houston, and she was going to come up to New Haven to tell me whether she would marry me or not. And so I didn't tell my students about all this. All I said was, I just want, I'm going to have to cancel office hours tonight. I'm dealing with something personal. That's all I said. And that night, out of the 25 students in the seminar, 18 emailed me that night and said, Professor Brooks, I just want you to know I'm thinking of you. I'm praying for you. And that little gesture changed the tenor of the class that whole term. Because suddenly I wasn't Professor Brooks. I was just another schmo getting through life. And it taught me you don't have to be too vulnerable. But as a professor, your instinct is to want to be impregnable, like I know it all. But if you can show some vulnerability, it just will change the relationship in the classroom. And the woman came to New Haven, and she told me she would never marry me. Now she's my wife, so it all worked out.
We're not mad. We're not mad. Listen, this is an amazing piece of work, and we want to thank you for writing it and for sharing your insights here at Duke as you have taught us about connecting with people, understanding ourselves, giving some grace and some space for personal and collective development. some guideposts, if you will, particularly as we look to a week from now when life is going to be crazy as hell, right? We thank you for that. And you have offered your own personal stories. So we certainly appreciate the vulnerability and the openness that you have shared with us. You talk in the book about we are all complex beings, many different layers, many different dimensions. And you have been kind enough to share yours with us. Thank you. Give it up for David Brooks.